The bar owner humiliated an 82-year-old Navy veteran like he was just some frail old man. 1 hour later, his former SEAL team walked in, and what happened next? No one in town will ever forget. It was a slow Sunday afternoon in Wilmington, North Carolina, the kind of sleepy day when locals gather at small, worn-out bars, more for habit than thirst. The place was quiet, just the clinking of glasses and murmurs of football banter on TV. That's when Frank Hutchins pushed open the door. He walked in with careful, deliberate steps, wearing a tan windbreaker that had seen better days. His voice, when he spoke, cracked with age. "Just a coffee, son." The owner, Curtis, barely looked up before letting out a sharp laugh. "This ain't a nursing home, Grandpa." The room chuckled. Curtis wasn't done. "You want warm milk too, or just the usual prune juice?" The words stung more than Frank would let on. He wasn't just any old man, though no one in that room seemed to care. He gave Curtis a long, unreadable look before turning around and walking out. No argument, no drama, just silence. But something about the way he left. Steady shoulders, back stayed in the air long after he was gone. An hour later, the door swung open again. This time, 6 men walked in, broad-shouldered, stone-faced, and quiet. The kind of men you don't question. No one knew their names, but Frank did. And Curtis was about to learn that there's a kind of loyalty forged in battle that time can't touch. Frank Hutchins had a quiet ritual. Every Sunday, at exactly 2:15 p.m., he walked 2 blocks from his modest apartment to Malone's Bar and Grill. He didn't come for the booze. Those days were long behind him. He came for the routine, the warmth of a hot drink, and sometimes the distant echo of camaraderie in the background chatter. But most of all, he came to feel, even briefly, like he was still part of something. That day, he paused outside the door just a second longer than usual. Maybe it was the humidity weighing on his joints, or maybe it was something deeper, that odd sixth sense veterans carry, like a radar that never really shuts off. He shook it off, pushed open the door, and stepped into the bar like he always did. Not begging for attention, just existing quietly in a world that had mostly moved on without him. Frank made his way to his usual stool, third from the left, closest to the wall. The seat was free, but the man behind the counter wasn't the usual bartender. Instead, a younger guy stood polishing glasses like he was the star of his own show. He looked about 30, cocky, too clean for a bar like Malone's. Frank cleared his throat gently. "Just a coffee, please." The young man turned, smirked, and looked him up and down. "Buddy, you sure you're in the right place? We don't serve inshore here." A couple of regulars chuckled. Frank didn't respond. He simply rested his hands on the counter, fingers stiff with age. "Coffee," he repeated, calm but firm. The kid Curtis, his name tag retilted his head like he was considering it, then shook it. "Nah, don't think so. We don't serve geriatrics unless they bring a caretaker." It was supposed to be a joke, but it hit like a slap. The room didn't erupt in laughter, just a few nervous chuckles, the kind people make when they're not sure which side they should be on. Frank looked around. No one met his eyes. He stood slowly, reached into his jacket pocket, and laid a single crumpled dollar on the counter. "For your troubles," he said softly, before turning toward the door. Just before stepping outside, Frank looked back once, not angry, not embarrassed, just disappointed. Like he'd seen this kind of thing before, but still hoped he wouldn't have to see it again. As Frank stepped out into the afternoon light, he pulled an old flip phone from his pocket and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After one ring, a gravelly voice answered. Frank simply said, "Code broken, Wilmington." Then he hung up. Curtis Mallory had owned Malone's for just under 2 years, but you'd think he built the place, brick by brick, from the way he acted. At 33, he was all swagger and sarcasm. A former college baseball player who traded his dreams of the majors for a downtown dive bar and a bank loan with strings tighter than his moral compass. He didn't care much for sentiment, especially when it came wrapped in wrinkles and nostalgia. To him, Malone's wasn't a community hub or a safe haven for old-timers. It was a business, his business, and he ran it the way he saw fit. Loud music, young regulars, cheap drinks, and no room for the past. The regulars tolerated him. He wasn't likable, but he was entertaining in a way that made you forget, momentarily, how mean he could be. He had a quick tongue and a flair for turning strangers into punchlines. When he mocked Frank earlier that day, it wasn't personal, not to him. Just another bit of theater, another laugh to break up the slow hours of a Sunday shift. But something about the room after Frank left it changed. It felt colder, more still. Curtis noticed it too, though he'd never admit it. He made a couple more wisecracks to break the tension, but the energy had shifted. The regulars went quieter. A couple even looked toward the door, like they expected it to swing open again. Curtis poured himself a whiskey he didn't pay for, leaned back on the bar, and scoffed. Guy should be grateful anyone even looked at him. Probably hasn't had real attention since Vietnam. He didn't know who Frank was. Didn't care. To him, the man was just another reminder of a time that didn't matter anymore. The kind of era people brought up only when it suited them. Glory days, stories, war movies, nothing real. What Curtis didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that in about 45 minutes, the kind of reality he'd only seen in movies was going to walk straight through that door, and they weren't coming for a drink. As Curtis refilled his glass, a woman at the bar, someone who'd been silent all along, leaned in and said quietly, "You have no idea who you just messed with." Then she turned away, leaving Curtis staring, the smirk starting to fade from his lips. Frank didn't tell anyone what had just happened. He didn't slam the door, didn't shout a single word. He simply walked, slow and measured, away from the bar. To anyone watching from across the street, he might have looked like a man who forgot what he came for. But inside, a storm had started brewing, not of anger, but of something older, something colder. Back inside Malone's, the laughter had died down. Curtis tried to revive it, tossing out a few more jabs about doddering old geezers, but even his favorite crowd pleasers weren't landing. The regulars sipped their drinks with awkward glances. One man near the jukebox muttered, "That wasn't cool," under his breath, not loud enough to start anything, but enough to sow discomfort. Curtis pretended not to notice. That was his thing. Brush off the unease, double down on bravado. But in the back of his mind, a flicker of doubt surfaced. Not guilt, not yet. Just a strange awareness that the room no longer seemed to orbit him the way it usually did. Meanwhile, Frank walked a few blocks down the harbor. He sat on a bench facing the water, pulled a small photograph from his wallet, and looked at it like a compass. It showed 6 men in wet gear, arms over each other's shoulders, soaked in mud and seawater. Their smiles were wide, but their eyes told a different story, the kind of bond that's forged in the worst conditions imaginable. He thought of them now, not for revenge, not even for comfort, just ... for what was right. What they'd promised each other years ago, in a place no bar owner like Curtis would ever understand. At the bar, Curtis glanced at the clock. 35 minutes since Frank had left. He reached for his phone, absently scrolling, eyes darting toward the door more than once. He wouldn't admit it, but something felt off, like the air pressure had shifted. Then, the door opened, but it was just the delivery guy. As Curtis signed for the order, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 1 hour. Be ready. No name, no context. Just the kind of message that makes your skin crawl, especially when you don't know what's coming. Frank didn't like using the phone. His fingers didn't move the way they used to, and the tiny buttons on the old flip model made texting nearly impossible. But there were some numbers he still remembered by heart, burned in by repetition. Necessity and brotherhood. He sat quietly on the bench, back straight despite the ache in his spine, and flipped open the phone. The screen flickered faintly. He scrolled through the contacts until he reached the one simply labeled Mac. He hit call. It rang once. Yeah. The voice on the other end was gravel and steel. No need for greetings. Frank didn't waste words. Code broken. Wilmington. There was a beat of silence. Then, understood. No questions. No hesitation. The line went dead. Less than 3 minutes later, in a garage outside Charlotte, Mac tossed a wrench into a bin, wiped his hands on a dirty rag, and called another number. "It's time," he said. Frank called it. On the other end, a man named Torres dropped his fishing pole straight into the lake. Within 10 minutes, 6 former Navy SEALs, now scattered across the state in various lives and disguises, were in motion. They didn't ask what had happened, didn't need to. The code was sacred. Broken meant one of them had been disrespected, dishonored, or endangered in a way that crossed the line. It wasn't about pride. It was about principle. About showing the world, even in old age, that the brotherhood didn't fade. That as they drove toward Wilmington, old habits kicked in. Radios crackled. Check-ins were brief and strategic. No planning was needed. They'd done this kind of thing too many times before. Only the location changed. The mission never did. Meanwhile, back at Malone's, Curtis was checking his phone for the 10th time. That text, 1 hour, be ready, wasn't funny anymore. He paced behind the bar, heart rate rising in that low, creeping way that precedes real fear. He laughed it off to a few regulars, saying, probably just the old guy's grandson trying to scare me. But he didn't believe it. Not really. Miles away, in a black SUV roaring down I-40, Mac looked at the man beside him and said, Frank's not the type to call unless it's bad. Whoever humiliated him, they just kicked a hornet's nest made of steel and war stories. They hadn't worn the uniform in years. Their hair was grayer, their joints stiffer, and their lives more ordinary than the history they carried. But make no mistake, these men weren't civilians at heart. Not really. Once you've been forged and fired together, there's no undoing that bond. And for Frank, there wasn't a single one of them who wouldn't come running. Mac, the de facto leader, drove in silence. In the seat next to him, Cole, the quietest of the group, kept his eyes on the road ahead, knuckles white on the dash. Torres was rerouting traffic from his phone like he was still running logistics in Fallujah. Behind them, a second SUV carried Denny, Boone, and Riley. Boone, still full of crude jokes and biting one-liners, tried to lighten the mood. Can't believe it took Curtis the known Bartle to bring us back together. But even he wasn't smiling. They all knew what Frank meant by code broken. It didn't mean he'd been punched or robbed. It meant something more painful. Humiliation. Public, targeted, and undeserved. The kind that wounds deeper than any battlefield shrapnel. And for a man like Frank, who had once pulled 3 of them from a burning vehicle under enemy fire, that was unacceptable. Their convoy moved fast, cutting through sleepy North Carolina towns with the precision of a SEAL mission. No wasted motion, no unnecessary stops. They didn't bring weapons. They didn't need them. Their presence was enough. Meanwhile, the air in Malone's had shifted from awkward to electric. Word had spread, not the full story, just enough to set rumors on fire. Someone said the old man was former military. Someone else claimed they saw him speaking into a radio, not a phone. Curtis laughed it all off, but his eyes flicked toward the entrance every time the bell above the door jingled. The bartender on the evening shift, an older woman named Trish, arrived and looked Curtis dead in the eye. What did you do? Curtis shrugged. Just told some crusty vet, we're out of prune juice. Why? She stared at him for a long moment. Because someone just parked a black SUV with government plates across the street, and the guy behind the wheel looks like he could tear this place in half with one hand. Just then, the door to the bar swung open, not slammed, but deliberate. Mac stepped in first, then Torres, then Cole. The air left the room, like everyone forgot how to breathe at once, and Frank, he followed last, eyes fixed on Curtis, not with anger, but with a calm, collected resolve that was far more terrifying. It wasn't the door slamming that made people stop talking, it was the way it opened. Slow, controlled, purposeful, like someone entering a room where they already knew they owned the space. When Mac stepped through, he didn't speak, he didn't have to. He just scanned the room once, registering every face, every movement, like he'd done 1,000 times before in far less forgiving places. Torres came in next, followed by Cole, and then Boone, Riley, and Denny. They wore no uniforms, carried no visible weapons, but everything about them screamed discipline, history, and power. They didn't look like old friends visiting a bar. They looked like judgment incarnate. Frank was the last to enter. He walked a few paces behind, his steps slower, but steadier now. No one made a sound, not even Curtis, especially not Curtis. The regulars froze in place. Even the ones who laughed earlier now stared at their drinks, suddenly ashamed to have ever chuckled. Trish, behind the bar, backed away without a word, making room. The 6 men didn't go to the bar. They went to a booth in the center of the room, a clear message. This wasn't a private reunion, it was a statement. They sat, perfectly at ease, like they were reclaiming territory. Frank remained standing, his eyes fixed on Curtis the whole time. Curtis tried to act unaffected. What is this, some kind of old-timer reunion? No one responded. He laughed, but it came out dry and strained. I mean, you got something to say it. Frank didn't speak. Mac did. You humiliated a man who once pulled a girl from a bombed-out compound under sniper fire while bleeding from 2 bullet wounds. Boone added, he didn't say a word about it. Not then, not now, but we were there, we saw it. Curtis blinked, his mouth opened, then closed again. Riley leaned forward. He didn't call us for revenge. He called us because he believed this place was better than what you showed him. We came to make sure it becomes that. Curtis, for the first time since taking over Malone's, didn't know what to say. He reached for a bottle to pour a drink, but his hands shook too badly to steady the glass. The bar was silent. Even the ice machine seemed to hold its breath. Curtis stood behind the counter, staring at the glass in his trembling hand, unable to pour. The presence of Frank and his former team had shifted the very air in the room, thick with quiet authority and something else harder to define. Reverence. Frank finally stepped forward, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His voice, though soft, carried with unexpected weight. We had a code, he began, when we served. It wasn't written down. It wasn't about rules or ranks. It was about respect. He looked around the room, not just at Curtis, but at everyone who'd watched him be humiliated. You live long enough, people stop seeing you. They stop listening. They forget what you've done. Or worse, they never cared to ask. But that doesn't erase the past. It doesn't change what we carried. Curtis muttered, I didn't know who you were. Frank raised a hand, silencing him without force. It's not about who I was. It's about who you are. He let that hang in the air. Max stood now, his arms crossed. Frank never broke the code in 40 years. Not during war. Not during loss. Not when we buried 2 of our own. But today, in this place, he broke it. And that should scare the hell out of you. Torres added, because when someone like Frank says enough's enough, that means something sacred was violated. Trish, standing in the shadows, quietly poured Frank a fresh cup of coffee and walked it over to their table. She didn't say a word. She just placed it gently in front of him and gave a small nod. Frank took a sip and exhaled slowly. I didn't call them to fight. I called them to witness. I wanted someone to see how easy it is for people to forget the value of dignity. Curtis opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of the regulars, a man who'd laughed earlier, stood and addressed Frank directly. I was wrong. We were all wrong. He looked at Curtis. And maybe you're not the man to run this place anymore. Curtis had always relied on noise. Noise to distract, to dominate, to control the room. He yelled when he was challenged, laughed louder when he was insecure. But now, in the middle of his own bar, surrounded by men twice his age and 10 times his strength, he had nothing to say, and that silence was louder than any outburst he could have made. Frank's team hadn't raised their voices once. They didn't threaten. They didn't posture. Their stillness was power enough. Each man sat with the relaxed poise of someone who'd seen real danger and knew this moment didn't require muscle, just memory. More of the bar's regulars began shifting in their seats. A few got up and quietly left, embarrassed. Others stayed, watching like they were witnessing a courtroom verdict. Curtis leaned on the bar, his face pale now, all bluster drained. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't know. Mac turned his head slowly. You didn't want to know. Frank didn't move. He let the weight of that truth hang. Torres pulled a chair backward and sat, elbows on knees, looking right at Curtis. You think respect is something people owe you because you run a bar. We were taught it's something you earn by the way you treat people when no one's watching. Curtis rubbed his jaw, but the words didn't come. Then, Riley, usually the quietest of the bunch, broke the stillness. You made that man feel like nothing. That might have been just another joke to you, but to us, that's a war crime in its own right. The silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. It was the kind of moment people remember, not for what was said, but for what WASN single quotes T. Frank finished his coffee. He stood, nodded to Trish, and looked once more at Curtis. You can keep running this place, he said, but you'll never own it. As the team filed out, calm and unhurried. A folded dollar bill remained on the counter, the same one Frank had left earlier, now crisp and clean, like it had never been crumpled at all. By Monday morning, the story had already started to spread. Wilmington was a small enough town that one Sunday incident could echo through diners, church pews, and barbershops like a storm rolling through. But this wasn't just gossip, it was folklore in the making. No one could quite agree on how many men had walked into Malone's, or exactly what they said. Some said 6, others swore it was 10. A few claimed they were still active duty Navy, summoned from some Black Ops base in Virginia. But what everyone agreed on was the silence. The way they entered, the weight they carried. Curtis didn't come back to the bar the next day, or the day after that. Eventually, he left town altogether, wordlessly, like a man who'd seen something he couldn't explain or outlive. Trish took over the bar temporarily, and people started calling it Frank's Place, even though Frank himself never asked for that. He came back a few times, always for a quiet coffee, always alone. Sometimes people would nod at him from across the room, not in pity, but in recognition, like tipping their hat to a man they suddenly realized had carried more than he ever let on. The other men, they returned to their lives. Mac to his garage, Torres to his fishing, Boone to his broken-down trailer on the outskirts of town. None of them talked about it. They didn't need to. They'd done what needed to be done, not out of vengeance, but out of principle, out of love. Years later, a plaque was hung near the booth where they'd all sat. It didn't say much, just a line, for the ones who still show up when it matters. People still talk about that day. Newcomers think it's just a tale, a bit of embellished local color, but those who were there, they know. And Frank, he never broke the code again, because in the end, all he ever needed was one moment, 1 hour, to remind the world that dignity doesn't age, and loyalty never dies.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?